Imagine an advanced alien civilization. One that has watched the stars for millennia, charting the rise and fall of countless empires across the cosmos. They have seen species rise from the ashes of their primitive past, unlocking the secrets of fusion, warp travel, and artificial intelligence. They have encountered conquerors, explorers, and wanderers, yet none have ever truly surprised them. Until now. One day, deep space probes belonging to the Zelthar Dominion, a vast and ancient, starfaring empire, detected something strange. A lone warship, seemingly primitive in design compared to their sleek and elegant vessels, was moving through the void of an unclaimed sector. At first glance, it was nothing remarkable. Its hull was dense, its shape angular, almost brutish. The Zelthar, masters of energy-based warfare, had long abandoned solid metal hulls in favor of advanced molecular shielding. But this ship, this human warship, had something else, something that didn't quite make sense. The Zelthar High Council, always cautious of new developments, ordered an immediate scan of the vessel. Their long-range quantum probes locked onto the ship, flooding it with data pulses and hyperspectrum analysis waves. The results came back within moments, and what they saw shook them to their core. This was no ordinary ship. It was an abomination, an engineering contradiction. It defied everything they knew about warships. Unlike most species, which relied on sophisticated energy dispersal systems to protect their vessels, this warship was built like a fortress of metal and fury. Its outer shell was composed of reinforced titanium alloys and carbon-infused composites, layers upon layers of dense material designed not just to deflect energy weapons, but to absorb impact like an ancient medieval castle wall. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The scans revealed something far more disturbing. Inside the ship's core, where the Zelthar expected to find a compact, efficient fusion drive, they instead found a raw, pulsating monster. A reactor that burned like a star and churned out more energy than any vessel of its size had any right to generate. The warship's weapon systems were equally horrifying. Unlike the precision-focused weaponry of most advanced species, which relied on particle beams and plasma lances, this ship was armed with kinetic railguns, massive, hyper-accelerated projectiles capable of shattering a cruiser in a single devastating shot. The Zelthar, who had long abandoned physical munitions in favor of energy-based combat, were stunned. To them, this was barbaric, crude, yet undeniably effective. And then, there were the missiles. Not simple, guided explosives, but strategic, self-thinking warheads capable of adjusting their course mid-flight, evading countermeasures, and delivering payloads that could rip through a fleet. The Zelthar had encountered missile-based warfare before, but not like this. These weapons weren't just designed to destroy. They were meant to overwhelm, to drown an enemy in relentless, unstoppable barrages. But the true horror lay within. The ship's final layer of defense, the one thing that made the Zelthar's scientists and tacticians question everything they thought they knew about warfare. The warship had no centralized AI control system, no grand neural network directing its every move. Instead, it was operated by humans. Hundreds of them. Living, breathing, thinking beings who worked in unison to control the ship's functions manually, making decisions in real time that no artificial intelligence could ever replicate. The concept was alien, archaic even. But as they analyzed the structure, they realized why. Humanity didn't trust AI with total control of its war machines. They had seen what happened when civilizations became too reliant on automation. They had studied the downfall of those who placed too much faith in cold logic. Their warships weren't just weapons. They were expressions of their will. Machines of war, driven not by calculations but by instinct, experience, and the raw, unyielding resolve of their crews. The Zelthar scientists hesitated. They ran the scans again. The results did not change. This was madness. No species they had ever encountered fought like this. No species built their warships to be controlled by organic minds when AI could do it faster, better, and with fewer risks. And yet, the data did not lie. This ship was not just dangerous, it was unpredictable. And unpredictability was the one thing the Zelthar feared above all else. Their reports were sent to the High Council, and within hours, an emergency meeting was called. The question that loomed over them was one they had never thought they would have to ask. Had they just encountered a species whose approach to war was so different, so brutal, so unorthodox, that it made even their mighty fleets vulnerable? Were the humans a threat? The Zelthar High Council convened in silence, their golden robes shimmering under the dim glow of the great chamber's celestial projectors. Holograms of the scanned human warship hovered before them, its crude yet terrifying design casting an eerie shadow across the hall. The room, usually filled with the confident voices of the most powerful beings in the Empire, was now heavy with uncertainty. The Supreme Strategist, a being who had led the Zelthar fleet through 100 victorious campaigns, studied the data carefully before finally speaking. "This is not just a warship," he murmured. "This is a declaration of intent." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Intent? What kind of civilization would build something so reckless, so inefficient by their standards? The answer was clear, one that had fought wars unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. A species that did not seek elegant solutions, but overwhelming, devastating force. The Zelthar had long relied on technological superiority to win battles. Their fleets were optimized for efficiency, their tactics honed over millennia of encounters with lesser civilizations. But as they studied the human warship, they realized something unsettling. It wasn't just powerful. It was designed to fight in ways the Zelthar had never prepared for. Their energy-based weapons, designed to overload shields and disable ship, systems with precision strikes, would be nearly useless against such a dense, armored beast. Their standard tactics, centered around graceful maneuvers and coordinated fleet formations, would crumble under the sheer brutality of human firepower. A single hit from one of those railguns could rip a Zelthar warship in half. A barrage of those guided missiles could decimate an entire battle group before they had time to adapt. For the first time in 1,000 years, the High Council felt fear. Their scientists provided further analysis. Humanity, they reported, had a history unlike any other. Where the Zelthar had conquered and assimilated civilizations through careful diplomacy and strategic subjugation, humans had clawed their way through centuries of conflict, adapting and evolving with every war. Their technology wasn't just about superiority, it was about resilience. Every system on that warship was built with redundancy in mind. If one power conduit was destroyed, another would take its place. If a section of the hull was breached, automated repair systems would seal it. If command was lost, another officer would step up without hesitation. No reliance on centralized AI, no dependence on fragile systems, just pure, relentless survival instinct. And that was the real problem. The Zelthar had always viewed war as a controlled, calculated endeavor. One where strategy outweighed brute strength. They had fought enemies that relied on overwhelming numbers, on superior technology, on deceptive tactics. But never had they faced an enemy that fought the way humans did. Never had they encountered a species whose entire military doctrine was built on adaptability, unpredictability, and sheer, unrelenting aggression. This ship, this single, solitary warship, wasn't just a threat. It was a warning that somewhere out there, beyond the edges of their empire, lurked a species that had mastered the art of war in ways the Zelthar had never imagined. A species that, if provoked, would not hesitate to unleash devastation on a scale the galaxy had never seen. The Supreme Strategist leaned forward, his voice grave. If this is just one of their warships, what do their fleets look like? The room fell silent. No one had an answer. And then the final blow came. A new transmission from their reconnaissance probes arrived. This time, from the human ship itself. It had detected the scan. It had pinpointed the location of the Zelthar probes with eerie precision. And in response, it had activated its weapons, not in aggression, not in a declaration of war, but as a message. The warship fired a single railgun, round into the void, a shot with no target, a shot with no purpose, except to demonstrate one thing: power. The kinetic slug, no larger than a cargo crate, accelerated to impossible speeds in the vacuum of space. Within seconds it reached velocities that defied logic, tearing through the dark like a spear of doom. The Zelthar's sensors struggled to track it, their instruments barely able to comprehend the raw energy behind the projectile. And then, minutes later, It struck an asteroid on the edge of the system. The impact released a shockwave that rippled across the sector. The asteroid, a floating mountain of rock and ice, shattered into a billion fragments, its remains scattering like dust across the void. No explosion. No lingering energy signature. Just pure kinetic devastation. The message was clear. The humans had seen the scan. They had responded. And now, they waited. The High Council stared at the screens in silence. The Zelthar, for all their might, had just encountered something they did not understand, something they could not control. For the first time in their long history, they asked themselves a question they had never needed to consider before. Should they fear humanity? Deep within the Zelthar Imperial core, the Supreme Strategist stood before an emergency gathering of the most powerful leaders in the Empire. The holographic projection of the human warship floated before them, every detail of its construction now thoroughly analyzed, dissected, and debated. The weight of the situation pressed on them like the crushing gravity of a collapsed star. For centuries, the Zelthar had encountered countless species, many of them warlike, some even capable of interstellar conflict. But none had ever designed a vessel like this. Nothing about it made sense from the perspective of Zelthar engineering philosophy. The ship was a paradox, primitive yet terrifyingly advanced, crude yet refined in its purpose. It defied every expectation of what a spacefaring species should prioritize. The materials alone were a mystery. Zelthar metallurgists had long abandoned solid armor plating in favor of energy-dispersing shield arrays. But the human warship had layered tungsten carbide composites, depleted uranium plating, and classified alloys their scanners couldn't even identify. Materials designed not to deflect energy, but to absorb, endure, and even return fire in the most devastating way possible. Why would they weigh down their vessel with such archaic armor? One of the science ministers asked, bewildered. The answer came from the lead military tactician, his face grim. Because they expect to be hit, and they intend to survive. This was not the mindset of a species that fought from a distance, relying on superior targeting systems and evasive maneuvers. This was a species that had waged wars in the trenches of their own planets, in the vacuum of space, and in every hellscape nature had thrown at them. They didn't seek to avoid damage, they prepared for it. And then there were the weapons. The Zelthar military relied primarily on high-frequency plasma lances, disruptor arrays, and long-range ion bombardments, all elegant, energy-efficient, and precise. The human warship, however, was armed to the teeth with an entirely different philosophy: brute force. Primary railgun batteries, accelerators that launched solid metal slugs at speeds that defied the laws of physics. No energy dispersion, no elegant disintegration. Just raw kinetic devastation capable of obliterating capital ships with a single well-placed shot. Nuclear-tipped torpedoes, not the refined, matter-disrupting missiles the Zelthar used, but fusion-based. Explosives designed to release hellish radiation and concussive force in a way that no shielding technology could fully negate. Point-defense laser arrays, not for offense but to vaporize incoming projectiles, countering enemy weapons before they could reach their target. Unlike Zelthar ships, which relied on deflective energy fields to protect against smaller threats, the human warship's defenses were redundant and layered, ensuring that no single failure would compromise the vessel. And finally, something even more disturbing: the ship's power source. Zelthar engineers had long since perfected quantum singularity reactors, tapping into microscopic black holes to generate near-infinite energy. Humans, however, had chosen something much simpler: a contained antimatter, fusion drive, volatile, dangerous, and capable of self-destruction if compromised. It wasn't just a power source, it was a last resort weapon. If a human crew was ever cornered with no chance of survival, they could simply detonate their own ship, not out of desperation but out of doctrine. "This is madness," an elder counselor whispered. "They don't just prepare for victory, they prepare for annihilation." The Supreme Strategist nodded. They fight wars as if defeat is never an option. If they fall, they make sure their enemies fall with them. A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the council. The implications were terrifying. The Zelthar had always approached warfare with careful calculations, weighing every risk, ensuring minimal losses while maximizing strategic gains. But humans didn't just seek victory. They ensured survival at any cost, and that meant they could never be truly conquered. As if to confirm their worst fears, a new report came in from the reconnaissance fleet. The humans had responded to the probe scan with more than just a demonstration of power. They had changed their formation. The warship was no longer moving alone. New sensor readings revealed additional contacts emerging from the depths of space. Dozens of ships, forming a tight, unbreakable formation around the initial vessel. Each one carried the same hallmarks of brutal efficiency: reinforced hulls, overlapping defense grids, and enough firepower to wipe out entire fleets. And the most chilling part? Their formation was not one of aggression. It was defensive. The humans were not on a campaign of conquest. They were not expanding their territory or threatening the Zelthar Empire. They were moving as if they had already been at war, as if they had fought an enemy beyond the understanding of the known galaxy. The realization sent shockwaves through the council. What had humans fought before? The supreme strategist turned back to the holographic display. The human ships held their positions, weapons inactive, shields online, sensors scanning for threats. They were waiting, watching, calculating. And then, a final transmission arrived. It was not a message of hostility, not a demand for surrender or an ultimatum of war. It was a simple, encoded data packet. The Council's best cryptographers worked feverishly to decipher it, expecting battle plans or a declaration of conflict. Instead, they found something infinitely more disturbing. The message was a tactical simulation, a war scenario, a battle projection showing a Zelthar fleet engaging a human battle group. It played out in real time with horrifying accuracy. The Zelthar's energy weapons failing to penetrate human armor, human railguns tearing through advanced warships like paper, the nuclear devastation of torpedoes rendering entire fleet formations useless. And then, an alternate simulation, a different scenario, one where the Zelthar and humans did not fight, but instead stood together, side by side, against something else, something far worse. The final line of the transmission sent a shiver down every spine in the chamber. You are not our enemy. Not yet. But the real war is coming. And when it does, you will want us as your allies. The chamber fell silent. For the first time in Zelthar history, an empire built on conquest and domination faced a choice they had never considered: war or alliance. But deep in the minds of every council member, one thought remained unspoken. Who, or what, were the humans preparing to fight? The chamber was eerily silent, the weight of the revelation pressing upon the minds of the Zelthar High Council. The holographic simulation flickered in the dimly lit war room, replaying the final line of the human transmission. You are not our enemy. Not yet. But the real war is coming. And when it does, you will want us as your allies. The supreme strategist exhaled slowly, his mind racing through centuries of recorded military history. The Zelthar had conquered dozens of species, outmaneuvered technologically superior foes, and even crushed rebellions before they could take root. They had never encountered a civilization that openly acknowledged the possibility of total annihilation and embraced it as a strategic doctrine. It wasn't just that humans built their ships for survival. It wasn't just their relentless, brutal efficiency. It was the implication that they had fought an enemy so terrible, so existentially threatening, that they had abandoned every traditional form of interstellar warfare to prepare for something else entirely. Who, or what, were they bracing for? A data analyst hesitated before speaking. Strategist. The message is more than a simple simulation. It includes records, transcripts, battlefield reports. They are encrypted, but our preliminary scans suggest they detail engagements outside of known space. The supreme strategist's gaze sharpened. Expand. The analyst hesitated before pulling up a set of distorted, corrupted battle logs. At first, the data was fragmented: static-laced sensor readings, incomplete distress signals, and cryptic human command transmissions. But the deeper the analysts dove, the clearer the picture became. The records were not theoretical. They were not warnings. They were reports. Accounts of real battles, somewhere beyond the galactic rim. And then, they found the first recovered image. The chamber's massive central display lit up with a grainy, enhanced frame. A celestial battlefield, strewn with debris. Wreckage spanning thousands of kilometers. Shattered human warships, their once imposing structures torn open like carcasses in a wasteland. But the most disturbing part, they had not died alone. The twisted, nightmarish husks of something else drifted among them. Not ships, not any conventional war vessels the Zelthar had ever seen. Their shapes were irregular, shifting, almost organic, as if grown rather than built. These wrecks had not been destroyed by simple explosions or weapons fire. They had been ripped apart, as if devoured. The chamber erupted into murmurs of disbelief. "Impossible," one counselor muttered. "Who could have done this?" Another counselor's hands trembled as she zoomed in on one of the remains. What are these?" The supreme strategist turned to the lead intelligence officer. "Have we seen anything like this before?" The officer swallowed hard. "No, strategist. Nothing in our records matches these entities. Their composition, their design, if you can even call it that, defies all known classifications." The realization set in like a slow-moving nightmare. The humans had fought these things, had clashed with them in the cold void of uncharted space. And judging by the wreckage, it had not been an easy fight. Another analyst decrypted a portion of a human combat log. The translated words sent an unnatural chill through the room. "We held the line. As long as we could. Their numbers are endless. They're learning, adapting. We lost the Vendetta, the Armstrong, and half of the Sixth Fleet. We are out of nuclear payloads. Railgun ammunition depleted. They're inside the hull." The message cut off abruptly. The lead scientist spoke in a hushed whisper. "This isn't just some enemy they encountered. This was a war. A war they fought in silence, away from the eyes of the known galaxy. The Zelthar had always assumed that their empire stood at the pinnacle of power, that their expansion was inevitable, their control unchallenged. But the humans had lived in a reality far more brutal than the Zelthar had ever imagined. They had already met something worse. And that meant only one thing. The galaxy was not as safe as the Zelthar had once believed. Another data fragment loaded onto the screen. This time, it was a direct combat analysis from a human AI system. The report contained an assessment of enemy capabilities, listing traits that made the alien adversary particularly dangerous. Adaptive biology, rapid regenerative capability, unknown form of hive intelligence, non-standard energy readings, observed self-replication. The final line of the report was the most chilling. Hostile entity is not an empire. It is a consumption-based force. It does not negotiate. It does not communicate. It only spreads. We estimate a 100% probability of total annihilation if containment fails. The Supreme Strategist's breath was slow and controlled. The implications of this were beyond catastrophic. A species that did not conquer, but consumed. One that did not fight for resources, but for growth. A cancer upon the stars, and the humans had been the only ones standing in its way. For the first time in Zelthar history, war was not a matter of conquest, but of survival. The Supreme Strategist turned back to the Council. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of an impossible choice. Humans had not sent this message as a threat. They had not demanded submission, nor had they issued ultimatums. They had simply revealed the truth. They had fought the darkness, beyond the stars, and they had barely survived. The final decrypted section of the human transmission loaded onto the display. This time, it was not a battle log. It was a simple written directive from a human admiral. "We lost billions holding them back. We bought time with blood, steel, and fire. But we are not enough. If the galaxy stands divided, it will fall. If you are reading this, understand one thing. The war is not coming. It has already begun." The Supreme Strategist closed his eyes. The Zelthar had ruled with an iron grip, believing themselves to be unchallenged in their dominance. But now, a far more terrifying reality loomed before them. They were not the hunters. They were prey. And the only question that remained was whether they would stand with humanity. or be consumed in the coming storm. The weight of the revelation settled over the Zelthar High Council like a suffocating fog. The supreme strategist stood motionless, his reptilian fingers tightening into a fist. His people had believed themselves the apex predators of the known galaxy, yet the data before him painted a far more terrifying reality. They were not alone at the top. In fact, they may not have been anywhere near it. The chamber's vast central display pulsed as new data fragments were decrypted. The humans' transmission wasn't just a warning. It was a desperate attempt to prepare the galaxy for what was coming. It contained battle strategies, failed tactics, and records of their most harrowing encounters. And then, the real horror unfolded. A long-range sensor capture flickered onto the screen. It was a tactical replay of an engagement between a human fleet and something else. The Zelthar military officers leaned in, analyzing the data. At first, the human formation was textbook. Warships holding a tight formation, shields overlapping, railguns synchronized for maximum efficiency. Their movements were precise, disciplined. They had the advantage. Then, the enemy arrived. The first readings were almost incomprehensible. No heat signatures, no visible thrusters. The enemy fleet didn't warp into real space in any conventional sense. It simply appeared, as if phasing through the very fabric of reality itself. Their forms twisted and writhed unnaturally, shifting between what looked like solid metal and something organic. A veteran Zelthar admiral watching the footage exhaled sharply. "That's not a fleet. That's a..." Before he could finish, the enemy moved. It happened too fast. Their ships, or whatever they were, did not fire projectiles. They did not launch missiles. They simply surged forward in an unrelenting tide, twisting through space in a way that ignored the very laws of physics. The first line of human warships opened fire. Railguns spat slugs of hyper-dense tungsten at a fraction of the speed of light. Energy lances licked out, searing through the void. Missiles streaked toward their targets, each one carrying enough destructive force to vaporize entire battleships. For a moment, the void was alight with fire and fury. The Zelthar officers watching leaned forward, expecting the human onslaught to crush the enemy. But the horror was only beginning. The enemy adapted. The first wave of railgun slugs tore through the leading attackers, shattering them into twisted fragments. But then, the others changed. Their forms rippled, shifting composition. The second wave of slugs simply passed through them, as if they were momentarily intangible. The energy lances struck next. For a brief moment, they burned through the nightmare fleet, until the enemy absorbed the energy, their forms pulsing as if feeding off the attack. The next wave of attackers moved even faster. Their ships were no longer just war vessels. They were living organisms, learning in real time. The human fleet's commander recognized the disaster unfolding. Desperation bled into the battle logs. "They're evolving. Every shot we fire, every weapon we use, they counter it instantly. They're not just machines. They're not just creatures. They're something else. Something worse." The Zelthar officers recoiled as the battle turned into a massacre. Human warships, once bastions of unshakable might, were torn apart like paper. The enemy didn't just destroy them. They infested them. Black tendrils, shifting like liquid shadow, slithered across hulls, corroding steel as if consuming the very essence of the ships. A Zelthar tactician, one of the most brilliant minds of their empire, whispered in shock, "This isn't war. This is a virus, a plague." And then came the final, most chilling revelation. As the human fleet fell, the enemy did something no ordinary predator would. They didn't just consume. They replicated. The wreckage of destroyed human warships twisted and warped, reshaping into new enemy vessels. The fallen were being absorbed, rewritten, transformed. The enemy didn't just destroy fleets. It added them to its own. The chamber was silent. Even the most hardened warriors of the Zelthar, those who had spent centuries crushing weaker civilizations, could feel the cold grip of fear. They had seen planetary bombardments, extermination campaigns, genocidal wars of attrition. But this was something worse. For the first time in their empire's long history, they were looking at a threat that could not be subjugated. could not be reasoned with, could not be bargained with, and humanity had already faced it. The supreme strategist turned to his intelligence officer. His voice was a low growl. "You said this was only a partial record." The officer nodded stiffly. "Yes, strategist. The full transmission is still being decrypted, but I fear we already know what it will say." Another analyst, shaking, spoke up. "Strategist, the humans did not send this to threaten us. They sent it because they need us. Because if this war comes to our doorstep, we won't survive it alone." A long silence stretched across the chamber. Tuts. Supreme Strategist clenched his jaw, his mind calculating possibilities at speeds beyond ordinary comprehension. The Zelthar had always viewed themselves as superior to humanity. They had seen the humans as reckless, dangerous, and unpredictable. But now, a far more terrifying truth was evident. Humanity was not preparing for war against the Zelthar. They were preparing the Zelthar for war against something else. And worse, still, humanity had already suffered. They had already bled, but they had endured. The Zelthar had a choice to make. They could continue their arrogance, believing themselves untouchable, believing their empire to be the peak of the cosmos, or they could accept the reality that humanity had laid bare before them. The galaxy was not as safe as they had once believed. The shadows between the stars held horrors beyond comprehension. And if they stood alone, they would fall. The supreme strategist exhaled slowly, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "We need the rest of that transmission, immediately." The analysts scrambled to comply, and deep in the void of space, beyond the borders of both the Zelthar Empire and human space, something watched, something listened, something waited. The war was not coming. It had already begun. The encrypted data continued to unravel, each fragment of the human transmission unveiling horrors the Zelthar had never dared to imagine. The chamber, once a place of rigid discipline and cold strategic calculation, now felt suffocating. Even the most seasoned warlords among them, beings who had raised civilizations and crushed planetary defenses, sat motionless, their gazes fixed on the unfolding nightmare. The decrypted files now revealed the names of those who had fallen, human colonies that had simply disappeared, entire fleets that had been reduced to nothing more than whispers in the void. Systems where the very fabric of space seemed to shudder in the wake of an enemy that defied conventional existence. The war humanity had waged in the darkness was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. It wasn't a war of empires. It wasn't fought over resources, territory, or ideology. This was something far worse. It was a war of survival. The Zelthar intelligence officer, his scales dulled with stress, hesitated before speaking. His voice was quieter than before, as if afraid to disturb whatever unseen force lurked in the depths of the cosmos. "Strategist, we have a new file decoded. This one contains tactical logs from a human fleet commander." The Supreme Strategist nodded sharply. "Show it." The data flickered into existence. A new battle. A new nightmare. It was a recording from the final engagement at Epsilon Crucible, a human stronghold that had resisted the enemy longer than any other. The battle footage began with a planetary defense grid, a web of orbital fortresses, automated gun platforms, and warships forming an impenetrable barrier around the colony. It was humanity's strongest bastion, a fortress world designed to repel any invasion. And yet, the humans had still lost. The enemy did not attack in the conventional sense. There was no warning, no fleets appearing on long-range scanners, no signs of approaching armadas. Instead, reality itself began to tear apart. The Zelthar officers flinched as they watched the footage. The space around the colony's defensive perimeter fractured, splintered, as if something outside of time and space had forced its way into existence. Black rifts, like gaping wounds in the void, opened across the system. From within those rifts, they emerged. The enemy didn't arrive in ships. They bled into reality, shapeless at first, swirling masses of anti-light that pulsed and twisted, defying physics. Then, as if remembering what form was, they solidified, shimmering war forms shifting between metal and flesh, monstrous constructs of an intelligence beyond comprehension. The human defenders did not hesitate. The fleet opened fire immediately. Planetary cannons erupted with energy bursts strong enough to vaporize entire dreadnoughts. Railgun slugs, massive projectiles traveling at relativistic speeds, slammed into the enemy forces. Swarms of fighter squadrons deployed, moving in coordinated formations to repel the invasion. The initial impact was devastating. The enemy shattered under the onslaught. Their forms broke apart, vanishing into the black void. For a brief moment, it looked as if humanity had the upper hand. Then, the enemy shifted. The rifts pulsed once, and something worse emerged. It was no longer just the monstrous vessels. Now, infested human warships surged forward. Ships that had once belonged to the Terran fleet, now twisted and malformed, their hulls pulsing with dark tendrils of corruptive energy. Their weapons turned on their own kind, unleashing destruction upon those they had once fought beside. The enemy didn't just destroy fleets. They assimilated them. The Zelthar warlords watching recoiled in horror. The implications were staggering. If this force reached their empire, if even a single Zelthar vessel was taken, there would be no stopping it. The footage continued, displaying humanity's last, desperate gambit. With the fall of Epsilon Crucible, inevitable, the remaining fleet commander issued a chilling command, one that sent shivers through even the hardened warriors of the Zelthar High Council. Initiate Omega Protocol. Wipe the system. A last resort option. The planet's defense grid, originally designed to protect the colony, was turned inward. The very weapons meant to repel invaders were now aimed at their own world. The humans chose annihilation over infestation. What happened next was beyond comprehension. The system burned. The planet's surface cracked apart as the superweapons activated, scorching the very atmosphere. The orbital fortresses detonated in sequence, sending shockwaves across the void. And yet, as the system collapsed into oblivion, as human warships sacrificed themselves to prevent the enemy from taking a single scrap of usable material, the enemy did not flee. They watched. Even as their hosts were obliterated, even as their twisted war forms disintegrated in the fire, they watched. And at the very last moment, just before the last fragment of Epsilon Crucible vanished into nothingness, they smiled. The recording cut to black. The silence in the Zelthar war chamber was deafening. Even the most ruthless generals, creatures who had wiped entire species from existence, sat frozen. This war, humanity's war, was beyond anything they had ever imagined. The Supreme Strategist's claws tapped against the stone table, his mind racing. Humanity had burned entire worlds to stop the spread of this enemy. They had fought and lost battles in the depths of space against an opponent that refused to die. And yet, they had not given up. They had survived. The strategist exhaled, his reptilian eyes narrowing. What was the last known status of this enemy? The intelligence officer hesitated. Unknown, strategist. The last recorded engagement was near the event horizon of a collapsing supermassive black hole. The humans lured the main force there and detonated everything they had. Their warships, their colonies, their very existence, all sacrificed to erase the enemy. A Zelthar admiral inhaled sharply. They ended it? The officer shook his head. No, they delayed it. The strategist's claws tightened into a fist. Then it's still out there. Another silence fell over the chamber. This was no longer about pride, no longer about superiority. The Zelthar, for all their arrogance, now stood at a crossroads. They could dismiss this as another human exaggeration, or they could accept the truth. Humanity had faced extinction. They had stared into the abyss and chosen to fight, to sacrifice everything for a galaxy that had not even known their struggle existed. And now, they had come to the Zelthar, not as conquerors, not as rivals, but as a warning and a plea. The strategist exhaled slowly. We need to contact the humans. The intelligence officer nodded. They're already waiting for our response. Far beyond the Zelthar homeworld, in the black void of space, a single Terran warship waited on the edges of their borders. Its hull was scarred, its weapons primed, and yet it did not advance. Because for the first time in galactic history, humanity wasn't asking for war. They were asking for allies. The chamber remained in a suffocating silence, the implications of what they had witnessed settling into the minds of the Zelthar High Command. The footage of Epsilon Crucible's last stand was burned into their memory. The monstrous enemy that had consumed human fleets, twisted their warships, and defied the very nature of existence. It was still out there. And now humanity had come to them. Not as invaders, not as rivals, but as messengers. The Supreme Strategist inhaled deeply, his claws gripping the edges of the stone table. Every instinct in his body screamed to dismiss this, to assume that the humans had fabricated some grand deception to gain the Zelthar's allegiance. But the terror in his officer's eyes, the cold certainty in the human records, and the sheer desperation of the final battle, none of it felt like a lie. He turned to the intelligence officer. "You said the humans are waiting for our response?" The officer nodded. "Yes, strategist. A single warship remains at our border. It has made no aggressive movements." A warlord, his thick armor plated in ceremonial gold, scoffed. "One ship? Against an entire fleet? They mock us." But another general, older and wiser, spoke with caution. "Perhaps, or perhaps they are showing restraint. If this enemy is real, strategist, then we face a horror greater than anything in our empire's history. The humans may have already fought it to a standstill, but they clearly do not believe it is truly gone. If it returns, do you believe our fleets could stand against it?" The Supreme Strategist remained silent. That was the question that haunted him now. The Zelthar Empire had existed for thousands of years, crushing every civilization that dared challenge their dominion. They had obliterated rivals, conquered lesser races, and expanded their reach into the farthest corners of the galaxy. But this was not a war they were prepared for. Finally, he straightened and spoke. "Open communications with the human vessel. I will speak with their commander personally." The chamber buzzed with quiet murmurs as the command was relayed. A secured channel was established. The transmission flickered for a moment. Then, with crisp clarity, a human face appeared on the main display. The officer was young, yet his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much. His uniform was unadorned, bearing only the insignia of his fleet. No medals, no decorative ranks, only the mark of a soldier who had survived. The Supreme Strategist leaned forward. "You have our attention, human. Speak." The human officer studied the Zelthar for a long moment. Then he exhaled. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the voice of a conqueror. It was not the voice of an enemy. It was the voice of someone who had seen hell and returned to warn others. "We don't have much time," the human began. "You've seen what we fought. You understand that it isn't dead. We managed to force it into retreat, but we don't know when it will return. What we do know is this. When it comes back, it won't just come for us. It will consume everything in its path. It won't care about our borders, our wars, or our history. It only has one goal: to devour and assimilate." The strategist's expression remained unreadable. "And you have come to us, seeking what? Reinforcements? Technology? Weapons?" The human shook his head. "No, we don't need your weapons. We don't need your fleets." The room stiffened. This was not what they had expected to hear. The human leaned closer, his voice steady. "We need unity. Not just between your empire and ours. Not just between a handful of species. The entire galaxy needs to understand what's coming. Because, when it returns, there won't be time for political maneuvering. There won't be time for alliances forged in desperation." He exhaled. "We need to be ready now." The Supreme Strategist studied him, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. His empire had spent centuries believing itself untouchable, invincible, the ultimate power among the stars. But the humans had been dragged through a war that no species should ever have to fight. And they had survived. That alone gave their warning merit. The strategist exhaled slowly. "You ask much, human. For generations our empire has stood alone, bending no knee to outsiders. You know this." The human nodded. "We do, and we know you don't trust us. We don't trust you either." But that doesn't matter anymore. Because, when the enemy returns, it won't care about our past. His voice dropped, quiet but firm. It will only care that we fall. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. The supreme strategist turned toward his assembled warlords and generals. The looks on their faces were conflicted. Some still resisted the idea, unwilling to acknowledge that their dominance was threatened. But others had seen enough. The strategist turned back to the screen. His decision had been made. He let out a slow breath, then spoke the words that would alter the fate of the galaxy forever. Send us everything you have, every report, every encounter. We will analyze it for ourselves. If your words are true, then humanity will not fight this war alone. The human nodded, relief flashing in his eyes. Understood. We'll send the data immediately. Welcome to the Resistance. The transmission cut. For the first time in Zelthar history, the Empire was no longer standing alone. For the first time, they had an ally. And far beyond the edges of both their territories, lurking in the cold void, something ancient stirred. It had waited. It had watched. And now, it knew. The galaxy was preparing for war. The war that would decide the fate of everything. Conclusion. Humanity's warning had been delivered. The Zelthar Empire, once their enemy, had been forced to accept a new reality. And though tensions still existed, though alliances were fragile, something had changed. For the first time, the galaxy was not divided. For the first time, it was united against something greater. But the enemy was still out there, lurking, waiting, and when it returned, the galaxy would be ready, or it would fall. The war had only just begun. Call to action. What do you think? Could humanity truly unite the galaxy in the face of an enemy like this? And what would happen if the war began again? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep space, narratives, and high-stakes sci-fi adventures. See you in the next one.